Welcome back to Fast Market. Alex Coffey, Kevin Green, KG. Let's talk some Apple. A lot, I think, overhanging and clouding Apple at the moment, whether it's margin compression from pressures to onshore to stave off potential trade policy impacts like tariffs or other restrictions with some of their offshore productions. But also the App Store stuff that's going on, where they're taking these big margins, but litigation trying to push back on that and perhaps shaping what the future in that part looks like. What do you make of Apple holistically as we look at this powerhouse of a business that seems to have a two-front pressure, both sides of its business?
Yeah, I think the street really wants to see a new product hit the market, something that's very innovative. Obviously, they're having some internal pressures, especially if you take away that Google business. I mean, I believe it's like 98% margin just for Google just alone, and they're having maybe some challenges when it comes to the App Store here. But we had that WWDC conference, and that just kind of underwhelmed the street. A lot of software enhancements, a lot of items when it comes to the services side of the business, which is very profitable, and you'd like to see it grow. But I think the street really wants to see something very innovative from this name, and it's been a very long time. We're not seeing that super cycle. They've delayed artificial intelligence rollouts. They're not really trying to integrate it with Siri. That's been an issue. So they've had a lot of headwinds, but I think this is it's unfortunately a name that's looked at as a hardware company, and it cannot get away from that. And so until they bring a new hardware product to the market, I think it's going to be very difficult for this one to sustain a significant price move to the upside here.
Let's expand this conversation a bit. We're joined now by the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com, Megan Brantley. Megan, happy Friday. Good afternoon to you. Building on what Kevin said regarding the desire for something new, I've had this long theory that the iPhone transition several models ago from a discretionary product to a staple. Does your data support either one of those? Is there interest in the Apple product still?
I think that, I have to agree with Kevin a lot in that the consumer is looking for something new and something innovative. And it seems like recent updates, at least among consumer perception, has been a bit lackluster. But then on the flip side of that, I will say we don't see consumers, leaving the Apple ecosystem en masse. If anything, we still see signs of growth in the Apple ecosystem. So it almost feels like a case where maybe consumers aren't getting this massive update, this massive upgrade in the iPhone or in a new device like they want, but they don't really have any other better options right now. And that may not always be the case, but when we look at Android mentions, when we look at Google phone mentions, other competitors, we just don't see that major traction, especially among US consumers. And what's interesting is this chart really surprised me. When I went in and aggregated a lot of these searches, I was shocked because if you look on the sentiment side of things, you see consumers feeling a bit underwhelmed with the technology in the iPhone. But if you look at searches, we actually have those up by double digits on a year-over-year basis. So consumers are still, kind of trapped into that upgrade cycle and that update cycle. And so this is one where, especially considering the pullback, you start to look and say, okay, maybe we are being a bit too tough on Apple right now. Maybe there still is this significant consumer interest because right now there simply aren't a ton of better options.
Megan, do you get a little bit of concern that maybe this refresh cycle is just being elongated more and more? It's not only an Apple problem when I look at the data. Samsung's having the same issue. Do you think that also could be leading to maybe some of this lackluster enthusiasm for this name because your phone's lasting a lot longer? Maybe you don't get a new one until the old one breaks, rather than looking at new products or new services coming with that phone. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that that's a really valid point. The product has gotten so robust and it's pretty indestructible at this point. You used to drop your iPhone in a body of water and it was done. Now, these things survive a lot and you can last longer and longer on these upgrade cycles. And so I think especially when there's a lack of newness, you may see, consumers a bit hesitant to upgrade, but now we're starting to reach a point where consumers have been waiting to upgrade for some time now, and maybe they're starting to see some battery issues on their phone, maybe their camera's not quite behaving or performing as well as some of their peers who have upgraded their iPhone. And so I think that there is, that little bit of pressure there to upgrade and say, I'm just going to bite the bullet. And so that's kind of what we're watching right now, because I was, just as surprised as maybe you are whenever I saw that uptick. And this chart right here, this shows web visits at large for Apple, all of its products versus its stock price. And you can see this tracking pretty much in line. If we look at visits on a year-over-year basis, it's pretty flat. And so if anything, I think, we're watching this for continued signs of bullish divergence just because expectations seem to be pretty low, and Apple still has a massive advantage when it comes to having devices, on consumers' wrists, in their ears, in their pocket with the iPhone, and they're continuing to prove that they can squeeze more and more out of that services revenue. So for now, at least, we don't necessarily see a lack of momentum. We see things, carrying on as they have been. And so you could start to make a case for a bet to the upside on, better than expected performance, especially heading into this next cycle.
Very interesting. When you look at sort of the dynamics that are also playing out, obviously impacting the stock price, whether that's squeezing margins we were talking about because of trade policy or perhaps litigation surrounding their services business, I imagine that always kind of caveats everything you're looking at when you're kind of passing your research on. When you see other things influencing the stock price beyond consumer activity, how does LikeFolio kind of, look at its data with that in mind?
I think that, whenever we see these kind of near-term headwinds that we aren't necessarily going to be able to pick up in our consumer-facing data, we really like to look at sentiment and say, okay, long-term, is this a brand that has continued pricing power? Is this a brand that is still building its audience? Is this a brand that consumers still want to shop with and conduct business with? And right now, even though sentiment, as I mentioned, consumers say things are a bit lackluster, that's about the same as it was last year. So nothing major has changed from a sentiment perspective. With its developer conference, we always see, it's funny because we typically do see a spike in negative sentiment there because people tend to be very critical of Apple because the bar is so high. So for us, whenever we see big pullbacks like this in a name like Apple, it really starts to be compelling and causes us to say, okay, at what point do we want to be buyers here? Because this is a company that right now has a pretty significant moat.
Good stuff. Megan Brantley, we wish you a great weekend, and thanks for taking the time and joining us here with the thoughts on Apple. Megan, of course, the VP of Research at LikeFolio. All right, Kevin, with that in mind, how are you looking at example trades here in this